thinking, what can I say about Sam? Like, what kind of nice things, can I get up here and say about Sam to introduce him? I mean, he is a husband, father, pastor at West Bradenton, president of Church Answers, but I thought really the best thing I could say for a conference like this is just show you a picture. And this was this past Sunday down at West Bradenton. They baptized at the beach 21 who profess faith in Jesus Christ. Isn't that awesome? Come on, Sam.
That really is the best introduction I've ever been given. Thank you. Thank all of you for being here and for joining us this morning. I'm excited to be with you. I'm going to jump right in it. I'm going to go about 40 minutes. So just kind of give you an idea of time here. And what I want to do over the course of my 2 sessions is to talk about a realistic perspective on revitalizing your church, practical and sustainable ways for you to grow. In the first session, I'm going to talk about just some things we're learning at Church Answers. I've got some numbers. I know it's early, but you've all had coffee, so it's okay. We're going to work through some research and just kind of explain, okay, there are normal-sized churches that are growing out there. What are we learning from them? And then my next session, in the afternoon, I will talk about 5 best practices. So hopefully, my goal in my 2 sessions is just to give you 2 or 3 things that you can take home, and you can go, I can use that. I can implement this. And so, anytime I speak, that's what I hope is to just give you some practical things that you can take home. So, I'm assuming all of you are where you are spiritually, and I'm just going to jump right into the practical stuff. I'm assuming you understand the gospel. I'm assuming you have a kingdom perspective. I'm assuming you're biblically based. So if you're going, where's the spiritual stuff? Well, we'll let somebody else handle that. That's your job at your church. So I want to give you some practical things. I'm going to begin with my philosophy. And if you've read some of my material or my books, you know this about me. If God can save any person, he can save any church. So we're talking about church revitalization. Now, I'm showing my theological cards here, and I'm not ashamed of them. I firmly believe that anyone can get saved at any time. I believe that if somebody wants to accept Christ and they have that desire, because that desire has been placed there by the Holy Spirit, that they can be saved. I firmly believe that anytime I share the gospel with somebody, that they're going to accept Jesus. Now, that's their choice. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I believe that at any moment, no matter how far somebody has gone, whether it be on a deathbed or whether it be a child who's 6, 7 years old, that if they're ready and if the Spirit is working, they can be saved. So if God can save any person, and if you believe that, there's a next logical conclusion there. Well, then any church filled with people can be saved. And so I approach church revitalization with this perspective that no church should die. There's really 2 driving principles here. 1, no church should die. There will be some churches that do, unfortunately. No church should die, and every church can grow. My first church was a mega church of 6 people. Maybe some of you can relate. I was 24 years old. I was working in the corporate world. I had not even read the whole Bible yet. Who hires that pastor? I'm 43 years old now. Hopefully I'm old enough to where I can confess some things to you. 24 years old, working in the corporate world, had a pretty good career path, was not wanting to leave the corporate world, was thinking I would go to these small, struggling rural churches. I was driving 2 hours one way to get there from where I lived in the city out into the country. And the reason that I found the church was my wife, was my girlfriend at the time, but now my wife. She was in college. And this church was so desperate that do you remember bulletin boards? Like, you put pins on, and there would be an actual piece of paper. This was prior to QR codes and things like that. And then pull tabs. Some of you remember the pull tabs. You'd have a piece of paper, it'd be an advertisement on a bulletin board, and there would be little tabs at the bottom with a phone number on it. You'd pull the tab and you'd call a number. for whatever you wanted, whoever it was you were needing to contact. Well, there was a church. She went to a college in a small town in Kentucky, and about 45 minutes, an hour away from there, which is 2 hours away from me, there was this church, very rural setting, and she saw this piece of paper, and she knew that I was preaching some, and she, I guess she sensed the call in me before I did, and so she pulled the tab, and I called the number. Herbie was the lone deacon. He answered. I had no idea what he said. I just assumed I was supposed to show up the next Sunday at 11 o'clock. This is Kentucky, and so he talked like he had marbles in his mouth. And some of you, if you listen to my material, some of you have heard this story. My wife is from Kentucky, so thankfully she could translate for me because I needed a translator whenever I went to church. There's so many. I could really spend the rest of my time talking about Union Band Baptist Church in Howardstown, Kentucky, and we could have a lot of fun there. I'll just tell you this one thing. They had literally just gotten rid of the outhouse. That's not a joke. Anybody ever preached at a church that had an actual outhouse? Yes, we got a couple. I knew we would. They had just gotten rid of the outhouse. They just put indoor plumbing in. And so anytime they talked about the throne room, it meant something completely different than as if I was preaching on Revelation chapter 20 or chapter 21 or chapter 22. At that church, we had more problems than people. We had no money. There was a 24-year-old pastor who had not even read the entire Bible yet, preaching, and no air conditioning, which that was our first capital campaign. Herbie said we need to go door to door. I thought he meant evangelism. We knocked on the door. I was ready to share Christ. He's asking him for money. And so it was a good combination because the people in the community were like, oh, the church is meeting again. And people started showing up. And they gave. And we got that air conditioner paid for. It's pretty wild. God worked. Really unhealthy church, terrible pastor. God's math is 2 negatives make a positive. That's his math. That tiny little church of 6 grew to about 40 people over 2 years. And I'm proud of that work. It wasn't me. I had no idea what I was doing. God worked. And though I could not have articulated it at the time, no church should die. I didn't have that philosophy. I had not worked out, how I do ministry. I was just getting started. So these 2 key driving principles of church revitalization, it's not something that was in my mind, but it was in my heart. I just believed that this church shouldn't die. Why? And if no church should die, then every church can grow. And I want to be careful about just focusing on the numbers and talking about church growth principles. Most of you have studied all of that. You've read all the books. So what I want to do is really just focus on 3 key words today in the 2 sessions that I'm with you: realistic, practical, and sustainable. What's realistic with your church? What's practical with your church? And what's sustainable? So when I talk about realistic church growth, we do some coaching and consulting at Church Answers. I've got a guy in New York State, I would say upstate New York, but then there's people that live north of him that say he's south. So it's one of those states. It's a very big state. But anyway, he's in a rural setting in New York. And his community is a smaller community, probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I'm working with him on some ways that he can, get his church to start thinking outward again. Now, I bring up this story because even if they reached almost everyone in their community, there's still not going to be a quote-unquote mega church, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, some of the things that are happening in the mega church. So there's this idea of let's be realistic about where your church is, the context, the people that you have currently, and just your footprint. Matt, I get parking lot envy whenever I travel. I pulled into your parking lot, and I'm just like, this is glorious. There are actual spaces, and they have lines, and not only do you have spaces, you've got like an outline beyond the space where, you can open your door, and it's a thing of beauty. I pastor a church that's in the city, and we're very limited on parking. And so when I come to a location like this, I'm just like, oh, this is so wonderful. So I want to be realistic, and I'll talk some about West Bradenton here in a moment. I want to be we have 310 spots. That's field and street parking, not just actual lined spots, 310 spots. We average 2.1 people per car. What's the maximum we're going? 600. We max out at 600 on our campus at any one time. So I want to be realistic. I mean, if you're in a rural setting, there's a certain context. That's just your context. If you don't have a big parking lot, or if you have a limited budget, I mean, we have to work within realistic parameters here when we're talking about church revitalization. There is this, I've read a lot of material on church growth. Let me just say this. Every time I read, it's as if some, not all writers, some talk about church growth as if there is unlimited potential. And I want to dispel the myth of unlimited church growth. That's impossible. That's a statistical impossibility in any one community. If you have 500 people in your community, the max that you can grow is 500 people. So you read a book that's talking as if you can keep growing. In statistics, we call it a hockey stick growth, exponential growth. It just keeps going up and up and up. That's impossible. That is statistically impossible. So we have to be realistic about where we are, what we have, and what we can do. But I also want us to be practical. And this is what I do in my calling to help with church revitalization, is to help with this real practical stuff. Okay, what is something I can actually do? Because if I'm just dreaming, which is fine, it's fine to have these dreams, but implementing is something completely different. And then I want us to think about sustainability. I lead my church as if the decision that I'm making will impact the next 100 years. I want to lead my church as if it's going to be around for 100 more years. Now, Christ may return. Praise God. At that point, we don't care. But assuming he doesn't, I want to make sure that I do something sustainable. Controversy and charisma are very dangerous ways to grow a church. Now, you can attract a lot of eyeballs by being controversial, and you can attract a lot of eyeballs by using your charisma. Now, if you're blessed with charisma, man, that's awesome. But let's not lead as if that's your only tool, because it's not sustainable beyond you. Or if that charisma just doesn't last, or if it wears off, which it can. People, once they get to know you over the course of 5-10 years, charisma only gets you so far. So we have to make sure that we grow churches in ways that are sustainable. But here's reality. We just have absolute crisis on our hands when it comes to evangelism. There is an evangelism crisis in North America. Only 1% of churches have an ongoing evangelism emphasis. Now, there's churches that do evangelism. Every church is always going to have that one person that's just sharing their faith because the Spirit has just led them to do that. You can have some pretty terrible churches and some pretty terrible church leaders and pastors in that church, and somebody will still be doing it because the Spirit leads and the Spirit works. But in terms of an actual emphasis, and it being not just a one-time event, but an ongoing evangelism emphasis, you may say program, and I know some were good in the past, some weren't. But we're down to just a bare minimum, just a sliver of churches that are actually emphasizing evangelism and doing it on an ongoing basis. This is a very real problem in our churches. It's something that I have taken to heart. I've got some solutions for you later and in my next session when we talk about the 5 best practices. Just know this: we are at a crisis point in North America. Now, you could go to Asia, you could go to Africa, and this there are parts where this would not be the case, but in our context, this is an extraordinary problem. So, here's a key question for you. How can your church grow by 10 to 20%? I think that's sustainable. I think that's realistic. If you are a typical sized congregation. What is a typical sized congregation? Anybody know? What's the median church size in the United States? Oh, 65 is the number. It depends on who's counting and how, but man, you guys know your stuff. Congratulations. Yeah, that's a normal size. So half the churches are smaller than 65 and half are larger. So just let that sink in. We've got quite a gathering here. You are significantly larger than the median size church, just the people that are here. And if you're at a church of like 50, that's normal. So I want to break this down, as best I can. So let me work through this. And the way that I'm going to work through this is actually to start at the larger churches. And just to say, and I want to speak to this because I like dispelling myths. I like giving facts. I like, just talking about reality. So let's be realistic. There is a waning of the megachurch movement. So what is a megachurch? Megachurch is 2,000 people, an average weekly attendance, that average taken over the course of a year. Now, there are some researchers, you have to watch them on this, you have to watch these researchers. They're changing the definition of a megachurch. Now they're saying, well, it's 1,500 or 1,200 people. Well, for decades, it's been 2,000. Now, why would you change the number? Because you want there to appear to be more megachurches than there really are. Let me just quickly, and there's a reason I'm walking through this, because I know most of you are probably not at a megachurch, and if you are, well, I still think this is something to listen in on. So in 1990, there were roughly 300 megachurches. By the year 2000, there were roughly 600 megachurches. You see the numbers. 2010, there were 1,600. And then by 2020, this was right before the pandemic, 1,700. Now, I'm synthesizing some numbers here and making them round. If you're looking for the actual numbers, I mean, they're not round. I'm just trying to make things simple here, breaking it down by decade and whole numbers. So these are approximate. As you can see, there was, again, hockey stick growth, exponential growth, really, between 1990 and 2010. And then something happened in 2010 that I noticed, like in 2011, 2012, where I'm like, man, there were some data points for the number of megachurches, and I'm like, is this slowing down? And it was. And now, if you're reading anything in 2012 or 2013, you're not hearing this. The megachurch movement was waning. And the reason that the megachurch movement was waning at that time and has continued to wane and is now in decline is because the megachurch movement was a baby boomer phenomenon. Most people don't know that. Who fills megachurches for the most part? It's baby boomers. Now, it was a wonderful thing at the time. Churches that caught that wave, they did a good job. There's plenty of large churches that I think very fondly of, and I think they reached a lot of people for Christ. I'm not saying this is a negative. I'm not saying what was happening in 2000 and 2010 is negative, not at all. In many ways, it was positive. But we have to face the facts. The facts is baby boomers are now aging. This movement has waned, is now in decline. There'll still be plenty of megachurches around, don't get me wrong. I've got one in my backyard. But now, we don't really know because of the pandemic and what are numbers at this point. People are just making stuff up. And they're like, yeah, we got 4,000 people watching online. And they're counting them. It's just tough to know. But we're probably around 1,000 megachurches right now, if you use the right definition, which is 2,000. Here's my point. If this movement is waning, because for years, people gravitated to the larger churches, and they drove an hour to get there. That's stopping. If this movement is waning and will eventually get into what I believe will be pretty steep declines over the next 10 to 20 years, there has to be something else. In my mind, that something else is the rise of the neighborhood church. You're in one right now. You're sitting in one right now. I think churches like this one, your church, are way more the future than anything else, particularly in North America, partly because of real estate. You know, I hear people bemoan, and I've never understood this. Oh, that town, they've got a church on every street corner, as if that's a bad thing. Why is that a bad thing? Help me out. If there's like a boatload of kingdom resources on every street corner in a town, those are kingdom of God outposts. Why is that a bad thing? Why are we talking about, church on every street corner, as if it's bad? It's like, well, it's better than a bar on every street corner. A strip club on every street corner. Go to Tampa, man. That's where I live in Tampa Bay. It's like the strip club capital of the world. Man, replace those things with churches. So, and I know why people say that is because those churches aren't doing anything. And that's why they bemoan. I get it. I know why people say that. But the reality is there are plenty of places in our nation that we have got a lot of real estate that we can put to work. A lot of, that church of 10 or 20, yeah, they're struggling. But man, what if they weren't? What if half the neighborhood churches in your community actually got healthy? It'd be awesome. Another reason that I think as the megachurch movement wanes and as the neighborhood church is on the rise, and a church like this is like the perfect worship space size. This is awesome right here. It's just the feel of the room. I'll name names. I don't mind doing this because I'll talk about churches that I love, that I think, I don't like throwing barbs or being overly negative. There's a church searching for a pastor at Idlewild Baptist Church in my area, Lutz. That's about an hour and a half north of me. But Ken Whitten is a mentor of mine. Incredible church. Amazing church. Absolutely love it. That worship space seats 5,000 people. 5,000 people. They have 2 services. Now, if they can figure it out, praise God. I'd love for 10,000 people to be there every week. That'd be awesome. But the reality is churches like that are going to be harder and harder to fill because millennials and Gen Z aren't looking for what baby boomers were looking for. They're looking for something different. And part of the problem is just the feel of the room. You walk in, so many churches I could talk about. You walk into the room, there's 100 people in a space of 2,000. And that's a tough thing to overcome. Another thing that I think that we're going to see, the reason that neighborhood churches can do well, this is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch, because these churches actually have to start doing gospel work. Many of them are not right now, but if they can get it together, there's a future. So I don't want to act as if the neighborhood church will rise. I just think it should. Well, financial sustainability. I wrote my dissertation on legacy churches in the Southern Baptist Convention, the biggest of the big and the most known, I'll just say that. And I interviewed one, and these are churches that I think highly of. And I remember sitting down with the executive pastor and just asking him, all right, man, what's next? You guys have done so much. Wow, what a track record. Just incredible successes here. And he's like, yeah, we need to replace the carpet, which I thought was a very strange answer. And I said, okay. And his head kind of sunk down a little bit. And he says, the hallways are going to cost $1 million. The hallways, to carpet them, $1 million. We've got 62,000 square feet, which is like 20,000. Like I'd rather have 40, but because we've got a smaller parking lot, bigger building, which was common at the time because my church was built during the baby boom era when people had one car and they'd come 5 and 6 per car. So it makes sense that the parking lot is the size that it is. It wasn't built wrongly, just culture changes. But we just got a bill for our new air conditioners. $3.9 million. $3.9 million to air condition 62,000 square feet. When were a lot of these mega churches built? 2000, 98, 2002. How long? What's the lifespan on an air conditioner? You know where I'm going. There's a lot of deferred maintenance bills that are going to come due on larger churches, and it's going to be sticker shock for many of them. But if you're a smaller church with a smaller footprint, there is a greater chance of financial sustainability. I do believe this is the way to go. I also think that bivocational and co-vocational ministry is on the rise. Those of you who are bivocational are like, yeah, we've been here for decades. What do you mean it's on the rise? I mean, we've been talking about this for years. Most pastors in the SBC, which is our tribe, are bivocational. The difference between bivocational and co-vocational is bivocational. A bivocational pastor will say, if I could be full-time, I would. Like, I would love for the opportunity to be full-time. My church can't do it right now. Co-vocational is kind of what I do. It's a choice to have two vocations. And you may differ with me on those definitions. Those are definitions that we've just kind of come up at Church Answers. But you get the point. There are those who are part-time, would love to be full-time. There are those who are, and I say part-time pay, not hours. I know that. And there are those who choose that option. But I do believe that these roles are going to be more and more popular. Over half of my team is bivocational. They receive, they're hourly even. And I think that that's going to happen more and more. I also think that we're not seeing so much of a stigma with small churches as in the past. It used to be, and this is a bit shameful, but, there would be this idea of, well, you pastor a small church, and there would be a bit of a stigma associated with that. We're seeing that go away. And what people hopefully are realizing is, in terms of your leadership, I mean, I inherited a church. Now, granted, I was 24 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. I inherited a church that didn't even have air conditioning. It had 6 people. Okay, so what do you do with that? Well, you can only take them so far, so fast. And so what a lot of people are beginning to realize is these leaders of small churches, they're actually really good leaders, because it's hard to take a church of 20, 30 people and get it to 60 and 70 people. That's hard. And I think people are coming to their senses about that. And we're seeing this stigma fade. I hope it does, continues to fade. Another thing that we're seeing with millennials especially, we'll see what, Gen Z's my kids, and they don't even know what they want right now. But millennials at least beginning to come to a realization, of what they prefer. And, there's this return to local preferences. There's people that prefer to shop local, to support mom and pa. Main Street is more popular than Wall Street right now. And neighborhood churches have that feel. They have that association. And we'll talk more in a future session about how to utilize that. But we are seeing a return to local preferences. And if you're a neighborhood church, you can have a more targeted ministry. We focus on 2 high schools at West Bradenton, 2 zip codes, 34209, 34205. And the reason it's 2 and not 1 is because the zip code line runs right through the church property. So we've got 2 zip codes. We've got the Christian school right down the road, and then we got the local high school right down the road. And that's our laser focus. We're not trying to reach people 20 minutes away, which in Florida traffic just maybe 2 miles. But on the way in here, it was just like open roads, beautiful clear skies. I was just like, this is, I'm driving at rush hour. This is amazing. So we're laser focused on our local community. If you're a regional church, you can't do that. You try to focus on one high school when you've got 6 high schools or 7 high schools represented in your church, it's hard. So if you're a neighborhood church, you can really do that targeted ministry. And I use targeted in a good way, not a negative way. And then lastly, why would the neighborhood church rise? Well, people just don't want to drive anymore. They may have to, but this work from home preference is not going away. It's not. And people are not going to drive an hour to church. Anyone remember the church with the billboards that said the drive is worth the distance? Anybody? Who was that? Man, come on. First Jacksonville, Florida. Lindsay, Vines. Anybody remember Lindsay and Vines? Okay, thank you. There's some people in here that remember. It was an amazing era. 2 good leaders. And they put up these billboards all the way to Georgia from downtown Jacksonville, Florida. And if I remember right, it said the drive is worth the distance. Meaning, you can drive an hour, hour and a half to church. It'll be worth it. It'll be worth it. And you know what? They were right. People did that. People aren't doing it anymore. So what they were doing at the time was fine. It just doesn't work now. And so we're seeing the possibility of neighborhood churches rise. But it's not going to happen unless we return to a work of evangelism. We have to recover an evangelistic culture. And I'm going to walk you through the stages of cultural change needed to lead a church towards ongoing evangelism. And these are, I'll be brief here, but we have a lot of apathetic churches. They know what to do, they're just not doing it. And so part of what you can do, and we'll talk more about hospitality in my next session. So I am going to get to hospitality, especially in the next session. But you've got to move from not caring to let's just be friendly, let's just be nice, and let's not just be friendly with the people we know in the church. Every church, like we're the friendliest church in town, with each other, not with guests. So you have to show that the first step is hospitality. I'll talk more in my next session. And then from hospitality to like actually inviting somebody to church. Something like, and my numbers may be just a little bit off here because I don't have them written down, but 80% of people in the culture are receptive to an invite to church. It doesn't mean they'll come every time you invite them, but they're at least receptive. They'll hear you out. We always focus on the 20% that like shut the door in your face, but there's 80% that are at least willing to hear you out. But only 2% of church members in any given year will invite somebody. We're not even inviting people to church. We've got to move from apathy to hospitality. Once you get, like the guests that are showing up, let's just be nice to them. Once you get that, let's start inviting people. And then once you're in the habit of inviting people, then you can start sharing the gospel. And once you're sharing the gospel regularly, you've got that ongoing emphasis of evangelism, then you're ready to start sending people. And I realize if you're a missiologist in the room, you're going, well, you can do all of those all at the same time. Yes, I know. I'm just trying to be realistic here. Church health will not improve until ongoing evangelism returns. That's the bottom line. Church health will not improve until ongoing evangelism returns. Let me show you a picture here. And I know that's very hard to read from where you are. I can't even really read it on the stage, but you see a pie chart, and there's a big chunk that's darker. That's the chunk of churches. So we did a massive nationwide study, all denominations at Church Answers, almost 5,000 people. And these are church members. And we just asked church members a very simple question. How long have you been a believer? Almost everyone, more than 11 years. So these are church members across all tribes. How long have you been a believer? Almost everybody. 11 plus years. Of 5,000 people, only 7 said less than a year. What is that telling you? It shows that we are just not doing events. There's no new believers in our churches. We're not even winning our children. That tells us that we're not even sharing our faith with our kids. It is such a crisis. And let me just guilt you into evangelism just for a moment. Evangelism will never die in your church if you do it. Evangelism will not die in your church if you do it. And I think God will honor the effort of one. But are you yourself even doing that? So back to that question, how can my church grow 10%, 20%? Well, let's say you're a normative sized church. How many people you got to reach to grow 10%? 6, 7, 8? Can you find 1 or 2 people in your church to help you go reach 8 people in a year? Yeah. Let's break this down into a very reasonable goal. If you find 3 people, 2 people to help you, just go get some other families, even if it's just inviting existing believers or new neighbors that are already Christians. Like, can you go find in a year 2 or 3 families, 1 a quarter, 1 every 3 months. And then can you find somebody else to do that with you? You reach 8 families in a year or 6 families in a year. Well, the 3 people in that family, that's 24 people. Now your church of 65 is 90. This is, you don't need like everyone in the church doing it. Sometimes we think we just got to preach and preach and preach and preach and they'll do it. They're not. You've got to go equip one-on-one for evangelism, and then it will grow. Let's skip forward to the next chart just for the sake of time, because I really want to get to this. All right. Now, I found this fascinating. Again, I do research, and I hope anytime you put charts up and you start talking numbers, sometimes people's eyes glaze over, so forgive me. But we're already in it, and I can't stop, so we're stuck here. So here, this is a chart from a think tank. It's got some numbers that the government's been tracking for decades and decades and decades, really since the 1940s. So if your eyes are bad like mine, you know, the left side of the chart is the 1940s. The right side of the chart pretty much goes up to the pandemic, right before the start of the pandemic. This is the data that we have right now. So this is the migration rate, U.S. annual migration rates, 1947 to the year 2020. What this shows is that in 1940, and again, I'll just break this down in a very simple way. What this shows is that in 1940, 1 in 5 people moved annually. By the time you get to 2020, again, this is before the pandemic. It would be even greater degrees now. Less than 1 in 10 people moved annually. Younger generations are not moving. The people that move are baby boomers because they're the ones that have the money to do so. People think millennials and Gen Z, but particularly millennials, man, they're moving all over the place. They are not. This is a fact. Young families do not move. They don't move. And this is a trend that has been in place for quite some time as the financial well-being of the younger generations has declined. Now, we could do a whole session on that as to why. But the reality is that younger people don't have as much money as their parents at the same age. They can't afford to move, so they're not. What this means is that if you are a neighborhood church and you focus on children and families, if you reach them, you're likely to keep them. Young people don't move. And every time I say this, I get the feeling like, well, I don't know that that's true. Well, it is. It's just the facts. Work from home is here to stay. High real estate prices likely are here to stay. Young people do not move. Reach them, you're likely to keep them. I ripped the Band-Aid off at West Bradenton. It caused a lot of heartache. We rearranged the budget. We did a lot of things. We said we're going all in with reaching young families. We did lose some people over it. But now 35% of our church is 18 and under. And most of those baptisms that you saw on the screen, thank you for showing that, are millennials and younger. And we're really seeing a movement of God. And it's hard. I tell my church all the time, we want to be multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-site, multi-venue, multilingual. We have 2 campuses, 4 preachers, 3 languages, 6 services, all on Sunday morning. It's chaos. It's awesome. You walk around the church, there's Mandarin, there's Spanish, there's English. A lot of fun. Let me end with this. Just got a couple minutes here. 4 ways to shift the culture from apathy to an expectation of growth. Let's work through these quickly, and then we'll give you some real practical things in the next session. We'll talk about 5 best practices. We'll kind of introduce some ideas here. All right, my culture is apathetic. My church really, they're not interested in evangelism. They don't expect to grow. That's part of the problem with these neighborhood churches. Is they've been 50 people forever. If you sent them 50 people, it would they don't know what to do. So how do we shift, just very practically, how do we shift the culture of our churches from apathy to, hey, we actually are expecting to grow? The first step is this: celebrate the bright spots in your worship services. This is good old-fashioned testimonies. You can do them in a modern way. You can record people. You can do 2-minute clips. You can have somebody greet the church and talk about what God is doing in their life. Every time we have a story of outward focus, we put it in our worship services. Whether it's somebody sharing their faith, somebody coming to Christ, somebody going on a mission trip. We've got missionaries coming in to speak. And Sunday morning, we have a very keen emphasis on outward focus. You become what you celebrate. My church, I loved them so much. They were very good to me. But First Baptist Church, Murray, Kentucky, the founding church of the cooperative program. A pastor there. When I got there, every service was death announcements, which was fine. And it wasn't even people in our church. Sometimes just like a neighbor died. And it's like every week, well, let's talk about who died. I'm like, is this how we're going to start worship of King Jesus? Every week. And I get that you have to communicate things to your church, and sometimes the worship service is the best way to do that. But like, good grief, we became what we were dead. Why? Because we did death announcements every week. You become what you celebrate. Include ways to put boots on the ground in your missions budget. So it's not just about funding, which is very important, by the way. You have mission partners, please fund them and fund them well. But part of our funding also includes we're going to get people there. So we provide scholarships to families who go on a mission trip together for all their children, particularly a first-time mission trip. So I've got a family. My family varies between 6 and 52 because we foster, and my wife brings children home like she brings groceries home. So. We've got a big family. At one point, we had five children, 4 schools in the morning. It's just wild. So families, and granted, millennials are not as wealthy as their parents. It's hard to pay for these mission trips. So we help fund families go on mission trips. Include ways to put boots on the ground in your missions budget. Don't stop your funding of missionaries, but find creative ways to put boots on the ground. That can be locally or internationally, both. Thirdly, hold staff and other leaders accountable for gospel conversations. My staff, they're meeting right now, actually. I'm with you, so my church is very gracious to let me do this. My executive pastor's handling all this. Gospel conversations is agenda item number 1 every week. And every week, it's the first thing we talk about. Have you shared your faith this week? Have you invited somebody to church? What's a story? And we expect a story every week from our staff. And we tell people that. Every week, we are going to talk about how we are sharing our faith. That's agenda item number 1. If a church does not have evangelistic pastors, the church itself will not be evangelistic. You have to do it. So we hold our staff accountable to those gospel conversations. And we expect people to share. You can do this in a fun way. It doesn't have to be overbearing, of course, but accountability is necessary. And then fourthly, we'll land the plane here. Resource ministries focused on the youngest generations. Now, I'm about to say something painful, and I'm going to end on the pain, so I don't know if you'll even come back for my next session, but this is the way I'm going to end, and I believe firmly in this. Does your children's ministry receive as much support as your worship ministry? Look at your budget. If your worship ministry gets more dollars than children's ministry, you're doing church wrong. Bottom line. You say you want to reach the next generation. You're not putting your money where your mouth is. If your worship ministry gets more money than the children's ministry, you're doing church wrong. And look at personnel costs too. If you've got a part-time children's director and a full-time worship pastor, no offense to any worship pastors in here, what are you saying? Now, don't go fire your worship pastor, please. They're like, oh no. No, that'll wreck your church. That's a good way to wreck your church. I hope you get my point though. Does your outreach efforts focus on those under 18? Every church is like, we want kids here. Great. Fund it. Resource it. I'll see you in the next session.